Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's presentation. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Confederate advance moving toward Pennsylvania just shortly before the Battle of Gettysburg. It's one of my favorite topics aside from the retreat from Gettysburg. And I know that at one point in time, Robin and I were talking about maybe doing an all day tour kind of visiting the different retreat sites out of Gettysburg, starting with maybe Fairfield, Monterey, Funkstown, trying to make our way to the Potomac River, more or less in Williamsport. So stay tuned for that because I'm very excited about doing that for you guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to the presentation itself. And you guys should pretty much see the presentation from here. So one of the reasons why I called this the communities along South Mountain during the Pennsylvania campaign is because when I was looking at how this invasion pretty much erupted, every community, whether it was along Emmitsburg, Maryland, for an example, or Frederick or Chambersburg, Shippensburg, everything is pretty much connected. And when you're reading about the Pennsylvania campaign of 1863, it's quite interesting because you had some minor actions that kind of built up to the climactic Battle of Gettysburg. Whereas several months earlier in September, you had smaller battles that erupted into the climactic battle, say, such as Antietam. And this is kind of interesting because of the fact that there's so much that's going on in Cumberland Valley with regards to the Confederate Army. And of course, the Union Army after the Battle of Chancellorsville, they're pretty much along down in that area of Virginia. And of course, Lee is trying to figure out what his next move is. And he'll eventually get like a 10-day head start on the Union Army, for a lack of better words. And what he'll do is he'll go ahead and correct his mistakes during the Maryland campaign. And what do I mean by that? Well, we'll kind of get to that here in a second. So, the Pennsylvania campaign versus the Gettysburg campaign. I know when I give these talks, everybody always asks me, why do I refer to Pennsylvania rather than Gettysburg? And really, both are correct to use. It's just when one hears the term Gettysburg campaign the same way that they hear the Antietam campaign, people kind of seem to lose focus of the events that took place prior and after that climactic action. Whereas when I tell people about the Pennsylvania campaign that leads to Gettysburg, people have a tendency of thinking outside of the Gettysburg area, and that's pretty much what one of my goals is to get them to think outside of the box. That way, if you want to think about Chambersburg or Monterey Pass or Shippensburg or Carlisle, even Harrisburg, it just kind of helps people to identify a broader range of an area where these events took place at. So, why the invasion? Well, it's very much the same as it was during the Maryland campaign. Number one, Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army, they're running on a series of massive victories. And his army, the morale, you can imagine, is very high at this point, and the morale of the Union Army is very low. So, but if you look at it from a much bigger picture, with Lee moving his army out of Virginia, well, he's going to force the Union Army to go chase. And because of that, he can relieve war torn Virginia, kind of give the citizens of Virginia kind of like a sense of normalcy, so to speak, without having to worry about feeding not one, but two major armies. And while Lee is conducting a campaign in the North, he can gather supplies. And if you ever heard me talk about the retreat from Gettysburg, Lee and his army took a lot of supplies from the Cumberland Valley. After all, it is the breadbasket. This is a long shot. Imagine a quarterback who's down by 14 points in a game, and he throws that Hail Mary to try to get those last couple of points to get up on the board. Well, this invasion is kind of same for Lee. It's a long shot, but a major victory in Pennsylvania would give him the possibility of having European recognition for the Confederacy. So, with that, that may not have happened anyway, because as we know in 1862, the powers that be in England went ahead and tabled that decision to support the Confederacy. But for Lee, it's a long shot. He also wants to take advantage of the social and political atmosphere of the North. The war, again, is unpopular, especially after a series of Confederate victories. If he can take advantage of the social morale of the North, as well as the political, those people could, in fact, tell their representatives in the next election that, you know what, just make peace with the South. Last but not least, the fact that so many Union regiments had mustered out of service after 6 months of enlistments were up. And we're talking about regiments like from Shippensburg area in the Cumberland Valley, like the 130th Pennsylvania, the 126th Pennsylvania, who went through the battles, whether they were at Antietam or Fredericksburg or Chancellorsville. And these regiments were pretty much decimated. And so with the fact that so many Union troops are mustering out of service and not volunteering, that kind of also could play into the whole morale regarding the social and political atmosphere of the North. So when you're looking at this, Lee really has thought this plan out pretty thoroughly. And for the most part, any of this, if he would happen to have a victory in Pennsylvania, this could change a lot of things for the Confederacy. So this map here, as you're looking at, this is the South Mountain Range looking basically at the Mason-Dixon line south. So for the Confederate Army, one of the things that they're going to make sure that they do properly this time, rather than ford the Potomac River at a place called Leesburg and make their headquarters at Frederick, Maryland, and then worrying about their communications to the Shenandoah Valley, Lee is going to go ahead and use the Blue Ridge Mountains to shield his army. And then as he is nearing the Mason-Dixon line, he's going to use the South Mountain Range also to kind of shield his army, but also he can establish communications as well as pretty much picking out his supply depots, such as Winchester and Chambersburg. So with that being said, Lee pretty much has an advantage here. When you're looking at South Mountain in Pennsylvania, and of course you can see Chambersburg, Shippensburg, up by Yellow Breeches, you can pretty much kind of imagine that's where the Carlisle area is going to be. Still, the South Mountain Range would cover his movements as he's marching northward. But then we know that there are several factors that come into play on this, especially when Major General Joseph Hooker's resignation is recognized and General George Meade is given the opportunity to command the Army of the Potomac. And that's another thing, too, that a lot of people get confused with, because when they hear about the Union resistance in the Cumberland Valley, everybody kind of seems to think that that was part of the Union Army of the Potomac, and it's not. It's part of the Department of Susquehanna, which is a totally different organization than what the Union Army that we know that fought at Gettysburg. So with this campaign, he is marching down the valley, getting ready to ford the Potomac River. On June 15th, the advance of his army in the form of Brigadier General Albert Jenkins's cavalry brigade, they're the first to ford the Potomac River at Williamsport, make their way into Greencastle, and by that evening, June 15th, he is pretty much making his headquarters at Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Now, Jenkins's brigade of cavalry, these are not what you would consider as cavaliers, as if you would compare them to, say, General Jeb Stuart's division, for an example. For the most part, Jenkins has conducted a lot of raids and small battles in an area that we know today as modern West Virginia, as well as parts of the Shenandoah Valley. His men are far from cavalry. Some of his men, when they came into Pennsylvania, they didn't even have sabers with them. Many of them didn't even have the proper carbines that a cavalryman would carry. And therefore, the term mounted infantry would be almost kind of given to them as far as their tactics. But the one thing that Jenkins was really good at, and that was foraging for supplies. And as he is hitting these towns in Pennsylvania, such as Greencastle and Chambersburg, his men are pretty much taking inventory. And there is some documentation where they're basically taking some supplies that are worn out for themselves, replacing it, and then basically loading up the supplies on the wagons and sending them back down to the advance of Ewell's Corps and basically saying, yeah, this is pretty much what we have found. It's really nothing. But at the same time, Jenkins was an honorable man. And what do I mean by that? Well, sometime during his stay in Chambersburg, one of his men was in a merchant store, and he was basically helping himself. And of course, Jenkins came in, saw what was happening, and he went ahead and slammed the hilt of his sword down on the counter. And he says, "We are not thieves. If you want that bolt of fabric, you're going to earn it. You pay for it. Don't steal it." So he did kind of, in some ways, keep a sense of order. But then on June 17th, coming out of Shippensburg area, you have Major William Boyd's detachment of the 1st New York Cavalry. And we're talking about the Lincoln Cavalry, not the veteran cavalry. And he sees the smoke being kicked, or the dust being kicked up in the background coming towards Scotland. And keep in mind, while Jenkins's cavalry was in Chambersburg, they did tear up a good portion of Scotland where the railroad yards are. Well, he automatically feels that he is automatically outnumbered, and he is going to go ahead and fall back well south of the Mason-Dixon line. And of course, when Robert Rhodes comes up with his division, and of course, General Jubal Early, who is on the other side there, and we'll talk about Early's division here in a little bit. But Jenkins pretty much gets blasted immediately for giving up so much territory without firing hardly a single shot. And that causes some friction within the Confederate ranks to the point where Brigadier General Jenkins is going to have to basically report directly to Lieutenant General Richard Ewell from here on out in part of this campaign. And what Ewell's doing, he's basically taken Jenkins out of the command of the other divisional commanders, and he is going to go ahead and give him the orders personally. So that way there's no more friction. At the same time, on the eastern side of South Mountain, the day that Jenkins's cavalry comes into Maryland and Pennsylvania, you have the town of Emmitsburg, Maryland. And Emmitsburg is not a very big town. It sits right along the Mason-Dixon line, 10 miles south of Gettysburg. It's got less than 1,000 residents on the eve of the Confederate invasion. During the night of between the hours of 10 p.m. and 11 p.m., a fire had started in the Beam and Guthrie livery stable. It burned about 3/4 of the town completely to the ground, as you can see in this photograph taken on July 7th. There was more than $75,000 worth of damages. 28 dwellings were destroyed, 54 families homeless. And this fire was started by a drunken Union sympathizer by the name of Eli Smith, who was arrested on suspicion of starting the fire. And according to his defense, he did that to prevent the advancing Confederates from taking supplies from the town. Keep in mind, that's very crucial because Emmitsburg will play host to the Confederates briefly, but more along the lines, they will play host to the majority of the Army of the Potomac before, during, as well as after Gettysburg. So, with Jenkins, he receives his orders beginning on the night of June 21st. Now, keep in mind, since the 17th of June up until the 21st, he has sent his brigades scouring all over South Mountain, North Mountain, and the Cumberland Valley, and they're foraging for supplies. On the night of June 21st, the 14th Virginia Cavalry, under the command of Lieutenant Shurrick, who was in command of Company D, he was in the Waynesboro area. And a thunderstorm had rolled through. And as his men were scouring the area, they came across a German farmer who saw them, and automatically he starts screaming. He's like, oh my God, the rebels. And of course, Shurrick replies back to him, if you give my men forage and some rations, I promise nothing will come and harm your family. And of course, the farmer had no choice at that time, but basically oblige the lieutenant. The next day, on June 22nd, he begins his way up the South Mountain area via the old Waynesboro and Emmitsburg Turnpike. And when he gets to the top of the mountain at Monterey Pass, he sees several companies of Pennsylvania militia in the form of cavalry. We're talking a company of the Philadelphia City Troop. We're talking the 21st or the 26th Pennsylvania Cavalry under the command of Captain Robert Bell and some others. And what they're doing basically is cutting the tops of the trees and blocking the Fairfield Road. That way, the Confederates could not come down South Mountain via Monterey Pass into Fairfield and eventually into Gettysburg. Well, there's going to be a sharp skirmish that takes place, and Sherrick's men is going to chase these Pennsylvania militia all the way to Fairfield, Pennsylvania, before Sherrick gives up the chase, turns his men following along the northern section of South Mountain all the way up to Cashtown. So Monterey Pass is one of the first skirmishes that takes place in the north. But then the very first skirmish actually takes place at Greencastle, followed by Monterey Pass. So it gets a little confusing as far as the times. At the same time that Sherrick's men were foraging for supplies along South Mountain, Jenkins has been ordered by Ewell to go ahead and take his brigade, minus the 17th Virginia Cavalry, because they have been dispatched and are covering the advance of Early's division. But he has been instructed that he needs to regain all the lost ground that he gave up and make it to Chambersburg by the end of the evening. North of Greencastle, there's going to be a slight skirmish between parts of Jenkins's cavalry and Major Boyd's Lincoln cavalry. And the end result is that Corporal William Ryle, he'll be the first Union soldier to be killed on Northern soil. Boyd and his men are going to go ahead and retreat into Chambersburg, where they'll wait for the arrival of Jenkins's brigade. From this point, Greencastle is occupied by parts of Jenkins's cavalry, and he's going to go ahead and spearhead to Chambersburg. This is all in the advance of Ewell's corps, consisting of Rhodes and Johnson's divisions coming up, and Jenkins needs to secure all that in order for them to come into Pennsylvania. So while Boyd's men are pretty much scouring the area looking for Confederates, the New York State National Guard, and this is a very interesting story, and I did a book on this, and I really feel bad for these New Yorkers, because when Abraham Lincoln, who's the president, issues a proclamation for 100,000 men to join the local militia, unfortunately, the surrounding states that he called for did not produce the manpower. Remember, in the beginning, I said with so many Union troops mustering out of service. Well, when Lincoln calls for the militia, there's a lot of hesitant people because they've seen the horrors of the war. So on June 16th, Edward Stanton, who's the Secretary of War, he is going to go ahead and contact the governor of New York to mobilize the 15,000 men of the New York State National Guard. And by the 17th, they're moving out by rail and making their way into Philadelphia. And from there, not knowing what the Confederate target is at this point, is it going to be Harrisburg, Philadelphia, or is it Baltimore or Washington? The New York State National Guard is going to start sending units to both Harrisburg and to Baltimore. So the famous 7th New York, for an example, who was supposed to went to Harrisburg, they were ordered to Baltimore immediately. Following behind them was the 8th and the 71st New York. And when they came into Harrisburg, these guys were treated very badly by the people of Pennsylvania. And that goes back to the whole, hey, these guys are acting like they're better than us. So we're going to go ahead and treat these people as if we are better than them. And that was because the people of Harrisburg, what they did was they either A, closed their stores, or B, they went ahead and inflated their prices, or C, the New Yorker saw so many young, able white men walking the streets without a care in the world. The New Yorkers got a little cocky about that. And there's a famous drawing, I love this. There's a clerk with a cup of water, and you see a New York soldier kind of going like this with his hat, scratching his head, and there's a sign on the wall that says Susquehanna water, 6 cents per cup. So fistfights, arguments are starting to break out in Harrisburg, which forces these men into camps. Knowing that the Confederates are in the Cumberland Valley, uh, General Joseph Farmer Knipe was ordered to go ahead and take these two regiments out by rail to Shippensburg, get to Scotland, basically repair the railroad yard that's there outside of Chambersburg. While they're doing that, on the day of the 21st, the 8th New York goes into Chambersburg. And of course, Rachel Cormany wrote in her diary, such excitement we had today when we saw these soldiers of gray coming back into Chambersburg. And then she writes, kind of like a dot, dot, dot. The excitement died when we found out that they were New York militia. So, but the people there in Chambersburg went ahead and lined the city street along the Diamond with all kinds of edibles. And then the pleasantry kind of turned sour. And that's when these New Yorkers saw, again, young, able white men walking the streets. Soon, arguments turned into insults, which turned into pushing and shoving. And finally, the officers had to rush the 8th New York out of Chambersburg very quickly. So by the day that the skirmish at Greencastle and Monterey occurs on the 22nd, the right wing of the 71st New York comes into Chambersburg, and of course, they are greeted very harshly and very coldly. In fact, they are rushed through the town before the people would start beating them. So, with all that being said, there's a famous editorial that came in just a couple weeks after the burning of Chambersburg, and I have that on the screen here. It says, "Save us now and hereafter from New York sympathy, but above all things else, save us from the New York militia. Come Jenkins, come Mosby, come McCausland, but against another visitation of the New York militia, good Lord, defend us." That says a lot right there, that the people of Chambersburg would have rather have a visitation by the person who's responsible for burning the city than having another visitation by New York. Unfortunately, when Boyd's cavalry fell back to Chambersburg, he notified uh, General Knipe about the Confederates coming up. Knipe has been ordered to basically stall the Confederate advance, kind of make a demonstration, but not get into any kind of an action. His his orders were to kind of give the impression there was more Union troops on the other side than there were Confederates. That way, they would keep second guessing themselves. So when Knipe went ahead and ordered a complete fallback, somehow or another, his orders to get from Chambersburg to Scotland were kind of miscommunicated to a full-fledged retreat. And it's known as the Chambersburg races. And what these New York guys did was they left everything behind in camp. They ran through the city streets disorganized. Some of them boarded the trains at Scotland. It was so chaotic that one entire wing of the 71st New York somehow or another missed a train. And they were forced to march back through Shippensburg up to almost Carlisle when the train came back to pick them up. And of course, when this happens, it allows for the occupation of Chambersburg to reoccur by the Confederate Army again. The people of Chambersburg never forgave the New Yorkers for this because they gave up the town without firing a single shot. So while the Confederates are marching south to north, so you have two divisions of Ewell's Corps with Jenkins's cavalry covering the road basically from Hagerstown up to Chambersburg. There's two other roads that lead from Hagerstown to Waynesboro. And as the Confederate Army is marching, Waynesboro citizens met up with some of these refugees during the afternoon and evening of June 22nd. And they found out that this major Confederate invasion is coming. It got so bad that the road to Monterey Pass over South Mountain became flooded with all kinds of refugees with wagons and carts and wheelbarrows. All the prominent men of Waynesboro who had any kind of dealings with banking or any kind of trade or commerce basically took all their ledger books with them, and they fled toward the direction of Gettysburg. So if you were a citizen in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, by morning of June 23rd, you were not getting out of this town. So the morning of the 23rd, that's when Major General Jubal Early and his division, they wake from their camp in Boonesboro and they start marching up through areas of like Cavetown, Smithsburg. There at Smithsburg, he detaches the brigade of Brigadier General John Gordon. His job is to move from Smithsburg over to Leitersburg to cover that last road leading south into Hagerstown from Waynesboro. And initially, what Early is doing is he's blocking all the roads leading out of Waynesboro. And of course, by that evening, Jubal Early's division is going to occupy Waynesboro with Early himself setting his headquarters up at the town council's office or the building. So while the Confederates are here in Waynesboro, there's a lot of letters that have been written, a lot of documentation, and some of it is really good information. However, some authors, like in the 1960s during the centennial, they confused parts of Hayes's brigade with the Louisiana Tigers, even though those regiments were still part of Hayes's brigade. The problem of it is that the notorious Tigers had lost that Zouave impression. So by the time that they get to Gettysburg, they're pretty much wearing, according to the quartermaster reports, Union trousers that they captured in Winchester, along with Richmond type jackets. So the French influence was long gone since the days before Antietam. But their reputation must have been something even here in Waynesboro, because when they set up camp along South Potomac Street, where the Union Church is, and the Union Church, you can see the brick structure at the bottom left of the photo of the the screen here. That's what the church looks like today. But the upper two photographs shows you what the church looked like when Jubal Early's division was here. So they made their encampment around there. And of course, when Early arrived in Waynesboro, one of the first thing he did was he closed all the liquor stills. But some of the Louisiana troops got a hold of some of the liquor, and of course, they got drunk and started walking around town. One Louisiana soldier walked up to a Waynesboro citizen, according to Mrs. Welsh, and he basically took his kepi off, looked at it, looked at this brand new big white stovetop hat, and he took it off the owner, put it on him, and took his kepi and put it on the owner. Now, according to Welsh, he was one of the first soldiers within Louisiana to be killed at Gettysburg, particularly with East Cemetery Hill. That, I don't know if it's true or not, but that's what she documented. But one of the interesting stories comes from when a Louisiana soldier smelled the aroma of fresh bread being cooked or baked, and he walked into this house, and there was a lovely young woman, and those two actually got to talking, and he was sitting at the table, and she was asking him where he was from, and he says, "I'm from Louisiana," and she started almost like she was getting ready to faint. And finally, she passed out. And before her body hit the ground, this soldier caught her. And as he is kind of like trying to bring her back to consciousness, her husband shows up. And of course, you can imagine the look that he had on his face. So the soldier kind of looked at the husband. He says, "Look," he says, I called her before she fell. I don't know what happened." And he says, "All I said was I was from Louisiana." And of course, the husband said, he says, "Louisiana Tigers have a very bad reputation up here." So he went ahead and gently placed the lady's head on the ground, and he pretty much got out of the house real quick. So that's just some of the interesting stories that were documented by Jubal Early's men during their stay here. One story that is very interesting is the Waynesboro Copperheads. Now, these guys had formed in 1862. I don't want to get into modern day politics, but these guys here were the pacifists of the Democratic Party. These guys were pretty much, hey, guess what? You know what? If the South wants peace, great. Let's just give it to them. But they would hold special meetings on the square of Waynesboro in the middle of the night, where they would hail the likes of Robert E. Lee and Thomas Jackson. But when the Confederates arrived here in Waynesboro, they pretty much exposed themselves. They came out and they were like, "Hail to the Confederacy. we're great you guys are here. And then as the Confederate soldiers are like, if you're for our cause, why don't you pick up a rifle and join us? And of course, by that point in time, being pacifists, these copperheads from Waynesboro are like, it's okay. You guys are doing a great job on your own. And it kind of got to the point where the more and more that the Confederate Army started interacting with these copperheads, they pretty much started, pushing them off to the side because of the fact that they're not going to help the cause by any means necessary. So they kind of were viewed as cowards, so to speak. So the Confederates, pretty much by the end of the 22nd, like I said, they're occupying Chambersburg. By the 23rd, they're in Waynesboro. Jenkins has been ordered to go ahead and move parts of his brigade into Shippensburg, Pennsylvania. And so on the morning of June 23rd, he's going to go ahead and start making his way through the Cumberland Valley out of Chambersburg towards Shippensburg. You have Major William Boyd and his Lincoln Cavalry, along with 1 to 2 companies of the 8th New York State National Guard. And they're pretty much dug in 2 miles south of Shippensburg. And by the time that Jenkins's cavalry comes into view, there's going to be a lot of skirmishing that goes on, and the Union troops are going to fall back through Shippensburg. And once they get to the square, they're going to go ahead and kind of barricade themselves, so to speak, to kind of buy as much time for the defenses of Carlisle to be built by the 8th and the 71st New York, who had made it there the night before. So, unfortunately for Boyd, I mean, his small command can no way stand up to these so-called veteran cavalrymen of the Confederate Army, and they're going to go ahead and fall back. The problem is that Jenkins himself will not occupy Shippensburg that evening. He's going to go ahead and kind of have some of his cavalry go into Shippensburg, and as the people of Shippensburg are waiting for the occupation, Jenkins is a little reluctant because, again, he feels that he's outnumbered and doesn't know what lies in front of him. This is another incident that is really going to upset the Confederate command. But from June 23rd to the 24th, the 25th, you have Confederate infantry that's starting to occupy Shippensburg. The 26th, and of course, the 27th. That's when the Confederate Army is basically, as far as Ewell's Corps is concerned, these are the dates that Shippensburg will be occupied. Now, some of the Confederate soldiers that came into Shippensburg were not impressed at all with the characteristics or the looks of the women. And in fact, they basically said in a short period of words that a lot of the Shippensburg women were quite ugly, and they were just not impressed with them. I found that kind of funny when I was reading through some of Rhodes's men's journals about that. So Shippensburg is yet another town that's going to be occupied, and of course, each town the Confederates occupy, the more requisitions for supplies that's being asked for. And I know in some case, especially in our exhibit galleries, we have a log that's been cut out, and somebody from Shippensburg basically put all the family valuables in that, and they put it at the bottom of the woodpile so the Confederates wouldn't take their valuables. So by June 24th and 25th, as the Confederates are making their way into Shippensburg, the New York State National Guard, along with now Pennsylvania militia, they're digging in just south of Carlisle. By 10 p.m. of June 25th, these Union troops were ordered to fall back to Kingston. By the 27th, the 2 Confederate divisions will begin occupying Carlisle. And of course, by June 27th, Knight's brigade is going to be skirmishing with parts of Jenkins's cavalry at a place called Oyster Point. So from this point here, Ewell's Corps minus Early, because Early at this point in time, you got to remember he's hitting up York City. He's got detachments at Wrightsville. Ewell, along with the other 2 divisions, they're marching directly toward Harrisburg. And they'll actually be able to throw artillery shells into Harrisburg before Robert E. Lee issues new orders for the concentration of the army at Gettysburg on the night of June 28th going into June 29th. So, with that being said, we got to go back to Chambersburg with regards to the Confederate Army, because as we said, Jenkins's brigade pretty much reoccupies Chambersburg from the 22nd. The last regiment will pull out of Chambersburg on the 24th, just as Ewell's divisions are starting to move in. By that point, Ewell's division or Ewell's Corps, those two divisions are going to start making their way out of Chambersburg to make room for Hill's Corps to come in. And him and his corps, along with Robert E. Lee, will occupy Chambersburg on the night of the 26th. From there, Hill is going to go ahead and start moving his army towards South Mountain via Fayetteville to make room for Longstreet's corps, which is coming up out of Greencastle. And from this point on, from the 28th on, basically to concentrate at a place called Gettysburg, Hill's got to move his corps, which allows room for Longstreet to bring his corps up, and then so on and so forth. Meanwhile, we got to talk a little bit about the Union Army, because really, aside from the New York State National Guard, we haven't said hardly anything about the Army of the Potomac. So on June 27th, parts of the 5th and 6th Michigan Cavalry have been ordered out of Frederick, Maryland, with their Brigadier General Joseph Copeland in command. They have been ordered to Emmitsburg, Maryland. They'll camp at a place called Tollgate Hill, which is kind of between Emmitsburg and Mount St. Mary's University. And what's really cool is that the history of the mountain, there's a whole couple chapters dedicated to the American Civil War. And one of the professors, by the name of Dr. Moore, he recalled that the first large body of cavalry that crossed by the college was the 6th Michigan Cavalry. And he was talking about how they jogged along four abreast. Of course, they retired and such. However, he did make mention that the 5th Michigan was carrying a new type of firearm, which was a repeater. And we're talking about the Spencer rifle. Joseph Bronner, who was basically a field hand at the where the St. Joseph's house is today, but it's the Daughters of Charity. He was given basically a receipt for 16,000 pounds of hay that was consumed by just the 5th Michigan Cavalry alone for basically for 2 nights. Now, of course, as we know, June 28th is pretty much the day where Major General Joseph Hooker is relieved of command, and Major General George Meade is given command of the Army of the Potomac. And along with that, you have an entire new structure of individuals taking their place, such as the promotions of lieutenants and captains in a case such as like George Custer, Judson Kilpatrick, and of course John Farnsworth. And so you have all these young, able-bodied men that are being promoted to general. And of course, Custer will move up to Emmitsburg, Maryland, where he'll take command of what will become the Michigan Brigade of his own on June 28th. And by June 29th, he'll move his brigade toward Hanover, Pennsylvania to kind of meet up with his divisional commander, Judson Kilpatrick. At the same time, as the Confederates are starting to occupy Fayetteville on June 28th between Monterey Pass and Site R, if you know where Site R is. It's kind of relatively near Blue Ridge Summit, but down in the crest where Jack's Mountain Road is, there's a small community. And you wouldn't know it today because the community, as the years progressed, moved from Jack's Mountain Road to just to the bottom of the hill where the grip mill is today. That's called Fountaindale. John Chamberlain, who's a lieutenant in Crenshaw's artillery, his horses are pretty much beaten pretty badly during this campaign. He needs fresh horses. So they'll leave Fayetteville, go up through Cashtown. They'll hit areas of Fairfield up, and they'll take Jack's Mountain Road all the way down to Fountaindale. And this kind of says something about the morale of the Confederate Army here, because when he came across church services taking place on the Sunday, he saw all these wonderful horses sitting outside. And with two revolvers pulled out, he'll go ahead and kick the doors of the church in. And he'll say, I'm requisitioning these horses, and you guys will be reimbursed through a peace treaty between the United States and the Confederate States of America. That kind of says something right there about the morale of the Confederate Army. They think that this battle or this campaign could possibly end the war. At the same time, in Boonesboro, Maryland, you have a detachment of Cole's Cavalry Company C, who are basically acting under their own orders. This was never written in any records except for a few letters and such, but Lieutenant William Horner and his cousin Sergeant Oliver Horner, with about 20 other guys, they'll go ahead and make their way out of Boonesboro up through Waynesboro. They'll come up through Monterey Pass, and as they're coming down off of the mountain, they come across this 25-man detachment of Lieutenant Chamberlain. And Chamberlain, he's an artillery officer. His men are artillerists. They're not really issued weapons as far as like long arms. So their main weapon is the cannon. And because of that, only 6 men were armed with revolvers. So he went ahead and ordered those men to make a stand with him, and they're going to charge the Lieutenant Horner, and of course, to kind of buy time for the other troops to get away. Unfortunately, everybody is pretty much captured. All the horses are returned, and the prisoners will be escorted to Emmitsburg, Maryland, and from there they'll be transported to Frederick City and eventually over to Fort Delaware, where the 7th New York State National Guard will receive them. But Fountaindale, just like Greencastle, as well as Monterey Pass, as well as the skirmish at Gettysburg, it's just one of those small incidents during this campaign, but it is well interesting nonetheless. So you have the Confederate Army in the Cumberland Valley. June 21st, the very first troops of the Army of the Potomac are marching across or fording the Potomac River, making their way into Frederick. They're occupying South Mountain, Pleasant Valley. General Hooker is trying to get the other departments to basically occupy these areas to keep an eye on the Confederate Army. He's trying to enact the Department of Washington, which does not want to listen to him, and it's because of the fact that he is not their commander. General William French, who is in command of the garrison at Harper's Ferry, he'll go ahead and basically evacuate Harper's Ferry, and his troops will go ahead and occupy the areas of the old South Mountain battlefield while they're waiting for portions of the First Corps to take their places. The Middle Department, which is in charge of like the Baltimore area, Monocacy Junction, even those commanders are very hesitant to even lend a hand to basically grab a hold of all the South Mountain gaps to protect the roads leading, over the mountain to Frederick and eventually to either Baltimore or Washington. At the same time, on June 29th, after a command change within the Union Army occurs, General George Meade does not like the layout of his Union Army, and he's going to order Frederick City to be the concentration point on the 28th. However, on the 29th, Buford's cavalry has been ordered to do some reconnaissance, and they're going to go ahead and leave out of their camps from Middletown to Boonesboro. They're going to make their way sidestepping Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, and they're going to arrive at Monterey Pass on the afternoon of June 29th. And of course, while they're up there, the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry that's with him, some of these men were from Waynesboro, Pennsylvania. He'll give them a couple hours to go ahead and head to Waynesboro to see their families. And from there, he'll do some reconnaissance. And while he is up at Monterey Pass, he can see the dust being kicked up in Greencastle, making its way to Chambersburg. And of course, these are Longstreet's men that he sees in the distance. From there, he allows his men to rest up. It's interesting to note that during their stay there was an elderly man who was holding the American flag. He had tears coming out of his eyes as he was thanking the Union soldiers who were basically riding by. But on the morning of the June 30th, he's going to send one regiment down to Fairfield, or what we call the Hagerstown Road. That's Mariah Furnace Road for those who know Monterey Pass well. And of course, they're going to skirmish with parts of Confederate outposts pretty much in that area of Mount was it Mount Hope or Mount Virginia? Virginia Mills Road, that's what it is. On that section of Gum Springs Road. And then the rest of Buford's cavalry is going to make their way coming down off of Monterey Pass into Fountaindale, and they'll take Jack's Mountain Road. And from there, they're going to skirmish with Confederate troops too. And for the most part, these are troops from Heath's division. Um, and of course, Buford, realizing that he does not want a major engagement to unfold, will order his cavalry back from Fairfield, and they'll make their way into Emmitsburg and eventually up to Marsh Creek Tavern, where General Reynolds is pretty much in command of the entire left wing of the Army of the Potomac. And from there, he'll report and then move directly to Gettysburg. From that point on, the Union Army, starting with the First Corps, followed by the 11th Corps, they'll arrive at Emmitsburg and Mount St. Mary's University on the evening of June 29th. From there, the First Corps make their way up to Marsh Creek by June 30th, and then the 11th Corps will occupy Emmitsburg, Maryland. And then once the 11th Corps moves out, the 3rd Corps with Sickles, Dacon come into play. Then you have other Union cavalry that's occupying Emmitsburg with other troops during the Battle of Gettysburg. And then after Gettysburg, there are so many stories of Pennsylvania businessmen who are charging some astronomical prices for produce as well as baked goods, to the point where the Union Army felt, some of those men felt that the Pennsylvania was a little ungrateful because of the way they're being treated. They defeated a Confederate army that's on the retreat. These guys are in the pursuit, and the things that they're getting is prices of things that are doubled. Well, Emmitsburg, Maryland, as well as modern day Thurmont, which was known as Mechanicstown back then, even though Emmitsburg was a burned out town, they pretty much gave the Union Army the last of everything they had to say thank you for the defense of the North against the Confederate invasion. So it's interesting when you look at how this campaign took place. It's easy for us to say, yep, Emmitsburg suffered a little bit. Oh, Shippensburg was occupied. But when you put all these communities and such together, it kind of shows you the much larger picture of how all these communities were affected, whether it be by the Confederate Army on one side of the mountain versus the Union Army on the other side of the mountain. And because of that, a lot of times I feel that even though I love the story of the retreat and pursuit after Gettysburg, sometimes when I'm sitting and thinking, I really do appreciate the advance of both armies as they make their way into Gettysburg, because sometimes I feel that this is more of an interesting story than the actual Battle of Gettysburg itself. Even though Battle of Gettysburg is one of the climactic and one of the major turning points of the Civil War, but at the same time, when we deal with the advance or the retreat, it kind of helps to complete the story of the Gettysburg experience. And to me, that is probably the most interesting aspect. I just want to say, Robin, thank you for allowing me to, talk with the group, share with the group. I'm going to get you guys back onto the mic, hopefully. You should be able to unmute yourself if you have questions. If not, I can definitely try to unmute you manually from somewhere else, because just like everybody else, I'm learning how to deal with Zoom on my own. So, all right, any questions? Okay, Tom, I'm going to try to unmute you here. How do you do this? Okay, that's me.
Now can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Okay, now we go. There we go.
I had to mess around until I got the right thing. That was really interesting. I've seen a different presenter do it a couple of years ago, but you filled in some gaps I didn't know about.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. And one of my favorite stories about the whole campaign was with the advance is the story of the New York State National Guard. And for those who don't know the story about these guys, a lot of them are wearing gray uniforms, very much like this in Pennsylvania in 1863. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, I'm from upstate New York. I didn't realize how much of the New Yorkers took part or participated. And I also moved to Williamsburg, Virginia, and I taught down there for 30 years, and we taught a lot of the Civil or the Revolutionary War. And I didn't realize how much of the stuff had gone right through Williamsburg at that time.
Okay, I see something here from Robert Cook to everyone. I'm trying to bring up the chat here.
I had to unmute myself. I'm not sure if that helps you at all. It looks like everybody's still muted.
Yeah, they should be able to unmute themselves if they want to ask questions. I think that's what you did, wasn't it, Tom?
I went to the bottom left-hand corner.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you have questions, you should be able to just go down to the bottom left-hand corner and just click where it says mute to, and should allow you to unmute. But I thought I saw a question here. Did the Confederates bivouac? All right. He said the Confederates occupied South Potomac Street in Waynesboro, but the Church of the Brethren is on South Church Street. Did the Confederates bivouac on Church Street? And of course, Church Street, as we know it, North Church Street back then was known pretty much as Mechanic Street. And I believe South Church Street was also known as the other extension of Mechanic Street. So North and South Mechanic Streets. The Church of the Brethren, I believe, is what it's called today, but back then it was the Church of the Union Church. And there used to be a cemetery there. And as you can see in the one drawing, those graves have been removed, and those individuals were reinterred. I believe. I'm trying to think if it was Burns Hill or if it was the other cemetery south of town on the Leitersburg Pike. And I spent some time researching that church, so hopefully I answered that question for you a little bit as well. Any other questions? Okay, Donald, go ahead, and you should be able to unmute yourself. Let's see here.
You should be able to hit that unmute button. Let me try it again. Let's see.
Okay, asked to unmute.
Uh-huh.
There you
Perfect.
go, Donald.
Perfect. Thanks, John. Hey, a question. It always fascinates me, those routes, Jack's Mountain and Mariah Furnace. When you talked about which of the two roads in got the most use, I heard you talking more about Jack's Mountain into Fairfield versus Mariah. Was Mariah used more on the retreat? Can you talk a little bit about those two roads? Because those were so critical coming through the pass.
Okay, so when you're looking at Monterey Pass with the beginning with the Union militia, like Robert Bell's cavalry, the Philadelphia, and that chase, when you're looking at today's perspective, the Hagerstown Road, or what they refer to as the Fairfield Road, both of those terms are correct. That encompasses all Mariah Furnace Road. And then from there, going into Adams County, or still in Adams County, it's Furnace Road. But once you get into, in Franklin County, it's Mariah Furnace Road to Furnace Road, and then Adams County, Furnace Road turns into Gum Springs, and then from there, Gum Springs turns into Iron Springs. The extension of Iron Springs Road, as we see it today from that split, did not exist in the 1860s. That was pretty much put in during the late 1860s, more along the lines of the early 1870s, when mining erupted and South Mountain became very prosperous for copper. So, yeah, Mariah Furnace Road locally, or the Fairfield Hagerstown Road, with the advance, we're only talking about a handful of troops using it, but more along the lines, it was used by the majority of the Confederate Army after the Battle of Gettysburg when they were leaving.
Okay.
Um,
Thank you.
you're welcome. And I'm going through it. I'm just asking to unmute here as many people as I can, just to see if that helps.
Now it works.
Okay, there we go. How
There
you
we
doing,
go.
Juan?
All right.
Okay, any other questions from the audience here?
Well, I always grew up hearing about how the Confederate troops encamped at Dykeman Spring and Shippensburg. I didn't know
Yes.
whether you knew what specific units camped there or not.
I do know that most of Rhodes's division pretty much encamped there. Remember that the story I told you about regarding about how ugly the women of Shippensburg were? That was an account taken from somewhere around the Dykeman's Springs as well, or the Dykeman Pond. So, of course, Rhodes would be there. Johnson's division wouldn't be too far behind them. Just kind of keeping them outside of town. That way they're not really, that way it's more orderly conducted.
It's interesting. I found that there's been encampments even in places that most people would never heard of, like out near Newburgh and it's just fascinating to me that they were all over. They were pretty much, like you said, scouring the valley for supplies.
Yeah, that's like there's stories of Jenkins's brigade being up in Path Valley. There's stories, and of course, I don't know if they tore the monument down or not, but I know there was a little bit of a skirmish that took place in McConnellsburg during this time period.
They put logs down. Some of those gaps going up over into Perry County, there were guys up there waiting they put big logs down across the mountain roads and waited up there just in case they'd start to come up over the mountains. But that wasn't their interest. Harrisburg, I think, was their interest.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for attending. Any other questions from the audience? I'm going to put everybody on gallery here. That way I can see everybody's hands going up. Any other questions?
Yes, Rich Bonnets.
How you doing?
Okay, good. Question for you. Where did Lee camp in the Chambersburg area?
I forget what the name of the woods is, but there is a highway marker just north of the town along Route 11.
Uh-huh.
I can't think of the name of the woods. It's something woods.
Messerschmitt's?
Yes. It's up by very close to Wilson College, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, okay.
Pizza Hut, not far from Pizza Hut. And
Yes.
the cemetery. You know the cemetery? You're coming 30 east. And the cemetery is on the right. Before you
Yes.
get before you get up to where you turn off to go to the middle school.
Yep.
Okay. So it was in that
Back
area there. huh?
There should be a marker there that says about Lee camped here.
Right.
It's so hard to see now because there's so much stuff.
Right. So it was along 30, is that
There
what you're
was,
saying?
yeah, it's right on
Mine
30
said
east.
back
There was a marker there.
Yeah.
And somebody knocked it down or it was torn down. And somebody
Okay.
got in contact with me. I'm Bob Wynn I'm with the Historical Society in Chambersburg. And somebody got in contact with me and said, "Where is the monument out there?" And I said, "What?" And they said, "Yeah, that thing's gone." And I
The marker,
got in touch
yeah.
with the state and they said, "Yeah, we know it's gone and we're going to put it back up." So I imagine by this time they have put it back up, but I don't know.
I have to take a ride out there sometime this week in between the weather and see, because I know that it was up at one point, Tom, but I think the last time I was through there, it was not up yet, and I kind of wondered what happened to it.
Okay.
So, any
Other question I have, John,
Yes.
is I always heard that Lee had eaten green apples on the way to Gettysburg, and that he had quite a case of dysentery during the battle. Is that correct? Did you hear anything about that?
I heard that he was not feeling that well during the battle, or during the campaign. I also heard about the story of the strawberry daiquiri, and
Never
apparently,
heard that one.
yeah, this was when I was with Emmitsburg. Apparently, the president come across this thing where the Battle of Gettysburg was lost due to the strawberry daiquiri, and it was because apparently the men loved it, including Lee. That it kind of, let's put it this way, for lack of a better word, it kind of went through their system very quickly. And that definitely would probably, to me, that kind of goes along the lines of, the dysentery and stuff like that. Yeah, Lee was not very, he wasn't very healthy in either of the two invasions of the North. In the Maryland campaign, you remember he got kicked off his horse and he was bandaged and rode in a wagon or a hospital wagon.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
No, thanks so much. This has been very, very interesting.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yes. Very good.
Thank you, John.
You folks are welcome. And Robin, I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor back over to you, but I just want to thank all the participants. Hopefully you had fun. Hopefully you learned a little bit more about the campaign. And if you guys have additional questions or anything like that, easy to find me. It's John.Miller@shippensburghistory.org. And of course, we are recording this. So if you want to come back to it, we can definitely have this up on YouTube, and we'll put it on our Facebook page as far as a link is concerned. That way you guys can go back, and I'll even send a link to Robin, and he can send it out to you, the rest of the group here, if you want to come back to it. So thank you very much, guys. And
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
for the rest of you, John is the executive director at the Shippensburg Historical Society. So when it does open up after hopefully the COVID pandemic is over with, you can stop in and see John at specific times that they're open. So just a short talk. As far as our March meeting, I am in contact with our speaker for March. I emailed him, I think it was last night. And I also want to get a